Now I lay me down to sleep. Introduction. There was a time in my life I thought fear would be the death of me. For most of my childhood, I was tormented by tales of unseen creatures of the night. Of course, there were no such creatures, but what did I know? The anticipation of meeting them was always a dark room away. I was taught to pray, if I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. For the Lord to take my soul was one thing, but for the creatures of the night to get me was another. Either way, I always saw a little hope for tomorrow, and I was afraid to go to sleep. Each night, fear stole my peace and kidnapped my sweet dreams. As obvious as it may sound, it takes a lifetime of lessons to remember that there's nothing to fear but fear itself. Most of my fears were silly, but at the time, being afraid was the only choice I knew. Fear was once my bondage. How I overcame it is my testimony. The reason I wrote this story is to bring awareness on how unsettled childhood fears can manifest into greater fears. My fears were almost like an addiction. I was always afraid of something. For many years, fear paralyzed me like a stun gun during my hours of sleep. Some of my fears were as good as taking a lazy pill because they held me back from becoming my best. I thank God that I can find a little humor in what I feared, and I hoped that many of my stories will invoke similar humorous memories to each reader. Chapter 1: The Basement. In 1956, when I was 4 years old, our family lived in a town called Stony Brook. My whole world centered around my father, mother, brother, and me, and of course, the place where we lived on Pine Street. Our house, our house's natural elements consisted of all kinds of trees, with the exception of pine. As for me, the willow tree the willow trees were the easiest to identify. Other than a shortcut to get across town, Pine Street did not have much to offer. Occasionally, tires of a car could be heard as it rolled over the gravel road. With the exception of the moon and stars at the night, our house gave the street its only source of light. Our cube-shaped house was covered with mismatched shingles, giving it an appearance of poor patchwork. The overhang on the front door or front porch looked like it was about to collapse. The springs on the front door was squeaky, and needless to say, the floorboards were in much needed repair. The house was divided into two living quarters, 6A and 6B. Spanish-speaking tenants lived in the main part of the house. Alongside of the house was a foyer that led to the basement, and that is where we lived. The kitchen had a huge black iron stove. It was used to cook our meals and heat the house. For fuel, Daddy used charcoal and wood. He got most of our wood from the trees on Pine Street. Our basement apartment stayed flooded with water to keep our feet from getting wet. Daddy built wooden skids and placed them throughout the basement floor. The two windows in the basement gave us some daylight during the day. Otherwise, our only source of light came from our television set and two bare two bare light bulbs. One light bulb hung in the kitchen area and the other where we slept. Usually, one of the bulbs burned at a time. The backyard of our basement apartment had a very uninviting outhouse. During that time, sunlight would shine through the missing planks, and at the night, we would use a flashlight or a candle. Mommy was always busy doing household chores, and caring for everyone was a full time job. Her name was Vera, but Daddy called her V. Being that our basement was always filled with water, Mommy often said the dampness in the basement was what gave us runny noses. The basement was also filled with shadows. Mommy entertained my brother and me by making more shadows for the motion of her hands. The rabbit and the bird shadows made me uncomfortable. My only siblings was my 2-year old brother, Joel Jr. We called him Winky on account that his right eye did not open too well. His episodes of coughing spells often led to frightful nosebleeds, so Mommy did her best to keep him calm and quiet. My first name is Mona, and Lisa is not my middle name, although most people insist that it is. It used to bother me, but now I don't mind. My real name is Mona Faye Cartman, and I don't mind smiling about that. For a short while, we owned a Cocker Spaniel. She had a short, wavy black hair. When she was given to us, she had a lot of ticks, so Daddy named her Ticky. Daddy used his Boy Scout skills to get rid of her ticks with his pocket knife. I don't believe that there was any tick that stood up to the heated blade of Daddy's pocket knife. I was forewarned not to pet Ticky, and yet I petted her anyway. The last time I petted her was on a hot summer day. It must have been real hot because she struck me with her paw. Her nail drew blood from right below my lower left eyebrow. And to this day I bear the scar. I never believed that it was Ticky's intent to hurt me, but Mommy insisted that Daddy take her for a one-way ride. I begged them to keep her and promised not to pet her, but Daddy put Ticky in the car anyway and took her for a ride. Although I never saw Ticky again, I continued to hope for her return. Most of my amusement came from playing with the dolls and watching television cartoons and children's programs. I also found TV commercials to be very entertaining. My other great amusement came from listening to the quarrels of the Spanish speaking tenants that lived in the upper part of the house. Although we didn't speak Spanish, I still found them to be amusing. Whenever I heard them speaking or arguing, that was where I made my ringside seat. I don't think Mommy found them entertaining at all. Often, when they got loud, she would clench her teeth to say, "I'll be so glad when those people move." Each time I heard those words, I would ask, "Why do you want them to move? Leave, Mommy." Her answer was always the same. When they move out, that is where that is where we are going to live. Daddy said our landlord was Miss Hawkins, who lived high on the hog. He said she also owned a chicken farm. However, what we lived in looked like more like a place for her chickens. Our house was one of many others she owned and rented for her own capital gain. Daddy always paid his rent on time. Often Miss Hawkins came twice a month to collect for her lucky jackpot. But Daddy was the lucky one because he always kept his rent receipts in conversation. Miss Hawkins always called Daddy Joel. That was his first name. As a child, Daddy seemed much taller than he is now. I referred to himself he referred to himself as being average height, although Mommy stood about 5'6" he stood about an inch and a half shorter than her. Daddy was muscular, his shoulders were broad, and his upper torso was shaped like a V. He always had a little bounce in his walk that would that could be noticed a mile away. His eyebrows arched like a mountain, which made his thoughts more readable, except for his mustache. He did not keep much on his face. His nostrils uh, were much wider than Mommy's nose. His skin was more like the color of a walnut, and Mommy's complexion was about half the shade dark, half a shade darker. Making 50 cents an hour was not exactly living large, but it kept food on the table and a roof over our heads and clothes on our back. Daddy worked for a chemical company named Galco. On weekends, he always worked at a restaurant where he parked cars for the customers. The tips he received enabled him to save money. For $100, he purchased land in a town called Mulberry. His dream was to build a house that we could live in and call our very own home, or call our very own. All right, so this is the reading of the first chapter of Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep, Where Was God When the Lights Were Out. That's the end of the first chapter. Please like, share, subscribe. This is The Boogeyman, number 2, Jereme Green. Peace.